Hello everyone. Before we get into today's story, I'm curious, where are you listening from, and at what time are you watching this video? Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy our stories. Now, let's jump into the video. The cold was the first thing to truly bite. A chill that had little to do with the perpetually failing thermal regulators of Watch Station Epsilon-Rho 7. Their ancient heat coils sputtering and hissing like dying beasts, coughing out lukewarm, vaguely metallic-smelling air that did little to dispel the encroaching iciness that felt as if it emanated from the very plasteel of the bulkheads, and everything to do with the way the shadows in this forsaken, God-Emperor-abandoned corner of Nexis Drift seemed to deepen with each passing, monotonous, soul-crushingly similar cycle. It wasn't a natural cold, not the honest, biting frost of the void that could crack plasteel with contemptuous ease and freeze a man's exposed breath into crystalline shards in his lungs in an instant. A clean, sharp cold that spoke of the vast emptiness between stars. This was a damp, clinging iciness, a cold that seeped into your bones like marrow leeches, insidious and persistent, and settled there. A cold that felt less like an absence of heat and more like a palpable, negative presence. An active, draining force that leached warmth, hope, and eventually sanity with equal, indifferent veracity. I felt it through the threadbare, thrice-patched, and perpetually grimy fabric of my station fatigues, a garment that had seen better decades and smelled faintly of recycled sweat and ozone, as I hunched over the flickering, unreliable console of the primary auger array. Its ancient, venerated machine spirit, if it still possessed one after so many years of neglect, isolation, and exposure to the drift's strange, unsettling energies, was coughing out streams of corrupted, nonsensical data like a dying man spitting black blood and final, incoherent curses against an uncaring, hostile universe. The very air tasted of it, this unnatural cold, a metallic, icy tang that coated the back of my throat and left a residue of despair, a constant reminder of our precarious, failing hold on life. The station itself, a forgotten sentinel rusting away in the dark, seemed to exhale this chill from its very plasteel bones, each groan of its stressed structure a sigh of icy resignation. My name is Silas Karras, and for my sins, and they were, according to the Adeptus Terra's labyrinthine, dust-choked, and infinitely pedantic ledgers, numerous, varied, and entirely unforgivable, ranging from unsanctioned experimentation upon holy mechanisms of STC origin to persistent and willful disregard for established litanies of operation and maintenance. And most damningly, the introduction of non-standard, potentially heretical, algorithmic deviations into sanctified cogitator cores. I was the current and likely final senior tech-acolyte of Epsilon-Rho 7. Senior was a grand, hollow title, a cruel joke in a place like this, a place where rank and distinction had long since lost all meaning, for a crew that numbered precisely 3, adrift in a forgotten, decaying monitoring post on the ragged, uncharted, and generally avoided edge of the Nexis Drift. The drift itself was a treacherous, swirling asteroid field and ship graveyard of ill repute, a vast, chaotic dumping ground for the detritus of millennia, a place where the refuse of galactic history slowly tumbled in the cold dark. It was notorious throughout the sector for its sudden, violent ion storms that could strip a ship's shielding in minutes, leaving it vulnerable to the hard radiation of the void. Its unpredictable gravitational eddies that could tear a vessel apart or send it tumbling into the unknown, uncharted regions beyond the Imperium's tenuous grasp. It was also known for its well-armed, desperate pirate enclaves, hidden within hollowed-out, drifting planetoids, preying on unwary scavengers and lost freighters. And, most disturbingly, for the unsettling, insidious whispers that clung to it like void lice to a dying void whale. Whispers that spoke of madness, of ghosts of long-dead crews still screaming in their spectral ships, and of things far, far worse, things that had no name in any human tongue. My crewmates, if such a term could be applied to being stripped of will, purpose, and anything resembling a personality, were 2 semi-lobotomized servitors, Unit Gamma and Unit Delta. Their vat-grown flesh, perpetually pale and clammy, stretched taut over their crude metallic endoskeletons like poorly cured leather, was beginning to show signs of decay, of a subtle, unhealthy mottling, a faint greenish tinge around their input-output sockets that even my limited Medicaid knowledge couldn't diagnose or treat. Their movements, once precise and efficient, the hallmark of Martian craftsmanship, were becoming jerky and imprecise, their hydraulic joints whining and sticking. Their augmetic eyes, usually glowing with a dull, unquestioning, and frankly unsettling obedience, sometimes flickered with a strange, unreadable light, a hint of something other than mindless programming stirring in their ravaged, repurposed brains. Their only conversation was the monotonous whirring of their internal mechanisms, the hiss of their overworked hydraulics, the click and grind of their servo motors, and the occasional, unsettlingly wet sigh of their strained, failing biological components. A constant, grim reminder of the Imperium's brutal, uncaring pragmatism, its willingness to reduce human beings, even its own faithful, to mere tools, to expendable cogs in its vast, grinding, and often pointless machine. 17 standard Terran years I'd been marooned here, a sentence handed down by a bored, indifferent administratum official with ink-stained fingers, a perpetual sneer etched on his sallow face, and a soul colder than the void itself. He had signed my transfer orders without even looking up, consigning me to this living tomb for gross dereliction of duty and unauthorized, unsanctioned modification of sacred cogitator systems. A fancy, bureaucratic way of saying I'd tried to make the damn things work better, more efficiently, to coax a little more life, a little more functionality, out of their original, thrice-blessed, and utterly archaic standard template construct designs. My fall from grace had been swift and brutal, from a promising, if somewhat unorthodox and often frowned upon, career in the hallowed, incense-choked, and rigidly dogmatic forged temples of Mars, where the Omnissiah's truth was law and innovation was often indistinguishable from heresy, to this rust-bucket mausoleum on the arse end of nowhere, a forgotten speck of dust in an uncaring galaxy. A slow, lingering death sentence by neglect, a fitting end, perhaps, for a tech priest who had dared to question the perfection of the machine god's ancient, unchangeable designs, who had sought to improve upon the sacred. Such hubris, I now understood, was rarely forgiven. Nexis Drift. Even the name, when I allowed myself to dwell on it during the long, silent, soul-crushing watches, when the only sound was the hum of failing machinery and the frantic beating of my own heart, tasted like ash, failure, and the bitter, metallic dregs of recycled water. It was a vast, chaotic, and utterly lawless expanse of shattered, drifting planetoids, the broken teeth of long-dead worlds, their surfaces scarred by ancient, forgotten cataclysms, their cores sometimes still glowing with trapped, dying energies. These dead rocks were tangled with the skeletal drifting hulks of long-dead starships from forgotten wars and ill-fated expeditions, their crews now just dust and echoes, their stories lost to the uncaring void, their final screams absorbed by the infinite silence. Swirling, ion-charged dust clouds, beautiful and lethal in equal measure, painted the void in hues of sickly green, angry crimson, and an unnerving, corpse-like violet, playing merry hell with auger readings and vox transmissions, isolating us further with each passing, monotonous cycle, wrapping Epsilon-Rho 7 in a shroud of interference and silence that was both physical and existential. For centuries, perhaps millennia, it had been a place where fortunes were sought and more often lost, where ships vanished without a trace, their names added to the endless, sorrowful litany of the lost that astropaths sometimes whispered in their sleep. It was a place where the desperate, the damned, and the daring came to pick over the bones of the past, hoping to scavenge enough scrap, enough archaeotech, enough forgotten lore, to survive another brutal cycle in the Imperium's unforgiving iron grip, or to buy their way to a slightly less miserable existence on some marginally less hellish world. Epsilon-Rho 7. An ungainly, corroded structure of stained plasteel and crumbling rockcrete, its original purpose lost to time and bureaucratic incompetence, its designation a meaningless string of numbers and letters in some forgotten archive, was bolted precariously, almost suicidally, to a larger, slowly tumbling asteroid of black, pitted rock that resembled a gigantic, diseased skull, its empty sockets staring out into the void. It was supposed to be a long-range monitoring post, a silent, watchful listening ear for the Imperium in this lawless, dangerous stretch of void, a tiny spark of imperial authority in a realm of chaos and forgotten gods. In reality, it was a forgotten relic, its systems failing one by one despite my best, increasingly desperate efforts, its meager supplies of nutrient paste, which tasted like chalk and despair, recycled water which tasted of rust and regret, and precious power cells, which held their charge for ever shorter periods, dwindling with alarming, terrifying speed. Its original purpose, if it ever truly had one beyond some long-forgotten, ill-conceived bureaucratic whim, a line item in some forgotten budget, was lost to the mists of administrative indifference and the passage of uncaring centuries. We were a ghost station, haunted by the ghosts of better days, the ghosts of previous equally doomed crews, whose names, warnings, and desperate prayers were scratched into the station's grimy, weeping walls, and the ever-present, gnawing threat of a slow, lonely, and utterly meaningless death, a forgotten footnote in the grand, bloody, and ultimately futile history of the Imperium. But the cold, the new cold that had begun to creep in like an insidious, invisible tide, a cold that felt alien and wrong, and the deepening, almost sentient shadows that seemed to writhe and coil in the corners of my vision, to stretch and distort familiar shapes. They were different. They were not part of the station's usual repertoire of decay, despair, and mechanical failure, the familiar litany of woes that had defined my existence for nearly 2 decades. They had started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a few cycles ago, a gradual unsettling change in the quality of the station's oppressive, claustrophobic atmosphere, a shift in the very texture of reality. A flicker in the station's ancient, sputtering lumen globes, their light already weak and unreliable, casting long, dancing, distorted shadows that played tricks on the eyes, making familiar objects seem alien and menacing. A momentary, unexplained dip in the already dangerously unreliable power grid, causing the life support system to cough and stutter, the recycled air to grow thin and stale for a terrifying moment, a foretaste of suffocation. A patch of darkness in a seldom-used, dust-choked storage corridor that seemed just a little too black, a little too resistant to the weak illumination of my flickering hand lamp. A darkness that seemed to drink the light, to absorb it into its unnatural, non-Euclidean depths. Then, the whispers had begun. Not the usual groans and creaks of the aging, stressed station settling around us like an old man groaning in his sleep as his bones turned to dust, nor the distant, ghostly sigh of the solar winds playing across the asteroid's pitted, airless surface like the breath of a dying, forgotten god. These were soft, sibilant, almost inaudible at first, like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten tomb floor in a forgotten, dead city on a forgotten, dead world, or the rustle of unseen silken garments in an empty, sealed room where no one had walked for centuries. They seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves, from the very walls of the station, from the humming, protesting machinery, from the depths of my own weary mind, to coil around the edges of hearing, promising. What? Forbidden knowledge that would elevate me beyond my fallen state, restore my honor, grant me power? Release from this agonizing, unending solitude, a communion with something vast and eternal? Or perhaps, simply, the sweet, final, irresistible oblivion of death? It was impossible to tell, but their effect was deeply unsettling, fraying nerves already stretched taut by 17 years of isolation, poor rations, dwindling hope, and a gnawing existential despair that was as constant and oppressive as the station's failing life support. The primary conflict, as I saw it, the one that truly mattered in these final, fading days, the one that had become my sole, obsessive, all-consuming focus, wasn't with the occasional, desperate pirate probing our weak, failing defenses. Their ships little more than rust buckets themselves, hoping for an easy score of fuel or spare parts. It wasn't with the hypothetical unseen Xenos threat we were supposedly monitoring for, a threat that had never materialized in all my 17 years of lonely, pointless vigil. A ghost story used to justify the station's continued, if forgotten, existence. It wasn't even with the slow, inevitable, grinding decay of our station and its failing, protesting systems, a battle I had been fighting and losing with dwindling resources and fading hope for nearly 2 decades. It was with this encroaching, insidious wrongness. This shadow that wasn't just an absence of light, but a tangible, thinking presence in itself, a creeping stain on reality, a subtle perversion of the laws of physics and the sanctity of the machine, a darkness that had weight and texture. This cold that wasn't just a lack of warmth, but an active, draining, life-leeching force that seemed to target the very spark of life, the warmth of the soul, leaving behind only a hollow, frozen shell. And the whispers, the damned, insidious whispers that seemed to know my name, my past, my failures, my fears, my secret shames, the ones I barely acknowledged even to myself in the dead of the long, silent, star-dusted watch cycles, when the only company was the hum of the void and the ghosts of my regrets. The manifests for Epsilon-Rho 7, if anyone in the vast, uncaring, and infinitely inefficient administratum still bothered to consult them, if our station even still existed in their endless, outdated, and often contradictory records, would list a crew of 3, 1 human, 2 servitors. A precise, bureaucratic number that failed utterly to capture the crushing, soul-destroying loneliness, the gnawing, ever-present dread, the slow, inexorable unraveling of sanity that was the true complement, the true horror, of this forgotten, God-Emperor-forsaken outpost. My unofficial charter, self-imposed in a desperate bid to retain some semblance of purpose, some flicker of my old Martian curiosity, some last shred of my tech priest identity in the face of encroaching oblivion, was to understand what was happening, to find the source of this encroaching darkness before it consumed what little remained of Epsilon-Rho 7, and its last, unwanted, and increasingly terrified inhabitant. The throne gelt for this particular investigation was non-existent, of course. The only reward the slim, desperate hope of survival, or at least, of understanding the nature of my own inevitable, approaching demise. A tech priest, even a fallen, exiled one, seeks knowledge, seeks understanding, even in the face of oblivion. It is our blessing and our curse. It is what makes us who we are, even as it leads us to our doom. The auger console before me, its plasteel casing cracked and stained with years of spilled, bitter recaf and my own frustrated, oily sweat, its keys worn smooth by my restless fingers, spat out another stream of corrupted, unreadable data. Its runic display a chaotic jumble of flickering, meaningless symbols like the prophecies of a madman, or the scrawlings of a dying astropath whose mind had finally shattered under the strain of gazing into the warp. The station's long-range sensors, once delicate, sophisticated instruments of Martian design, capable of piercing the dense, ion-charged dust clouds of the drift, of detecting the faint energy signatures of passing void ships or anomalous stellar phenomena across vast interstellar distances, were now little more than expensive, useless paperweights, their delicate, thrice-blessed systems succumbing to the strange, dampening, and subtly corrosive energies that seemed to emanate from the heart of the nebula, or perhaps more chillingly, from the encroaching, sentient shadow itself. I slammed a fist, hard, onto the console in a spasm of helpless, impotent frustration, a gesture that would have earned me a severe reprimand, possibly even a ritual scourging with sanctified electrified cables by a senior magos, back in the disciplined, emotionless, and rigidly ordered halls of the Martian Mechanicum. Here, in the decaying solitude of Epsilon-Rho 7, surrounded by ghosts, failing machinery, and my own encroaching madness, it was just another small, futile act of defiance against an indifferent, hostile universe, a brief spark of anger in the face of overwhelming, soul-crushing despair. The console flickered violently in response, its internal components groaning in protest, then went dark with a final, pathetic sigh, emitting a puff of acrid, blue smoke that smelled of burnt insulation, ozone, and shattered hope. Another system dead, another nail in our collective forgotten coffin. The shadow was winning, one dead circuit at a time. "Anything, Unit Gamma?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse, raspy like stones grinding together, the words catching in my dry, constricted throat. I addressed the servitor that stood motionless, a silent, hulking, and increasingly unsettling sentinel, by the main airlock, its multispectral optical sensor, a single, unblinking red lens, fixed on the void beyond the reinforced, thrice-glazed plasteel viewport. The viewport itself was now coated with a fine, almost invisible layer of the strange black crystalline dust that seemed to be seeping in from the outside, or perhaps forming spontaneously on any exposed surface. Unit Gamma's massive articulated limbs, designed for heavy lifting and external repairs in the harsh, unforgiving vacuum of space, were still, its internal chronometer likely the only thing still functioning perfectly within its decaying augmented frame, ticking down the seconds to our inevitable demise. Negative, Master Karras, its synthesized voice droned, devoid of inflection, of any hint of emotion, yet somehow carrying an undertone of the station's pervasive, suffocating gloom. A chilling reflection of the despair that had seeped into the very walls, into the very soul of this place. External visual arrays report standard particulate interference. No identifiable vessel signatures. No anomalous energy readings within designated operational parameters. All is nominal. Standard. Always standard. Nominal. Even when the shadows crawled with unseen, unimaginable things, and the whispers promised damnation and a terrible, cold, and strangely, perversely alluring peace. The servitors, with their limited, programmed perceptions, their carefully excised imaginations, and their surgically suppressed emotions, were blind to the true, existential horror that was unfolding around us, a horror that transcended mere physical threat. Or perhaps, I sometimes wondered with a shiver that had nothing to do with the station's unnatural cold, they saw it all too clearly, understood its implications far better than I, and their silence, their impassivity, their refusal to acknowledge the wrongness was a mercy, a refusal to articulate the unspeakable, to give voice to a truth that would shatter my remaining sanity. The air in the command module, recycled 1,000 times too many, filtered through ancient, clogged, and undoubtedly fungus-ridden systems that probably harbored more contagions than they removed, tasted stale and metallic, like licking a rusted, corroded bulkhead that had been weeping unknown fluids. It was tinged with a new, faint undertone that had become more noticeable, more pervasive in recent cycles. A dry, dusty scent, like ancient, disturbed earth from a freshly opened grave in a forgotten cemetery, or the air from a long-sealed, forgotten crypt on a world that had died before humanity first reached for the stars. This was mixed with a faint, almost imperceptible, yet deeply unsettling sweetness, like decaying, exotic blossoms from a world long dead and consumed by cosmic horrors, or the cloying, sickly perfume of a Xeno's funeral rite I had once, unwisely, witnessed. It was the scent of the shadows I had come to realize, the perfume of the encroaching wrongness, the breath of the entity that was slowly, patiently, and inexorably claiming our station, our minds, our souls. It clung to my clothes, to my skin, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the unseen presence that shared our lonely, desperate vigil. A presence that felt both ancient and terrifyingly, intimately familiar, as if it had always been a part of me, waiting for the right moment to awaken. I pushed myself away from the dead console, my joints stiff and aching from hours spent hunched in the same uncomfortable, poorly designed command chair, its synth leather upholstery cracked and peeling, exposing the yellowed, decaying foam beneath. The station was a labyrinth of corroded, dimly lit corridors, their walls weeping with a strange, oily condensation, failing, sputtering systems that coughed and died with increasing frequency, and echoing, pregnant silences, a tomb adrift in the uncaring void. My first, most pressing task, now that the primary augers were offline and the station was effectively blind to the universe outside its cracking hull, was to assess the integrity of the outer sensor pylons. They were located on the far side of the asteroid, a treacherous, kilometer-long EVA walk across its pitted, airless, and dangerously unstable surface, a surface littered with razor-sharp rock shards, hidden crevasses, and the frozen drifting debris of whatever ancient catastrophe had created this cursed drift. If they were failing, if the shadow was somehow blinding us to external threats or to its own insidious, creeping approach, then our isolation would be complete, our doom all but sealed. We would be deaf, dumb and blind, adrift in a sea of encroaching darkness, waiting for the inevitable, silent end. As I moved towards the main airlock, my mag boots clanking hollowly on the grated deck plates, their magnetic grip uncertain on the corroded, slime-coated metal, the shadows in the corridor seemed to stretch and deepen, to writhe with a life of their own, as if the darkness itself were a sentient, predatory creature, its tendrils reaching out for me, caressing my skin with an icy touch. The whispers intensified, coiling around me like unseen, ethereal tendrils, soft, seductive, and utterly terrifying, promising an end to the loneliness, the despair, the gnawing, endless fear that had been my constant companion for 17 long, soul-destroying years. Silas Karras, we see you, we know you, Your struggles are noted, appreciated. Your pain is understood. You are not alone, never alone. You have never been truly alone. We have always been with you. Join us in the quiet, in the cool, in the dark. There is peace here. Such peace, such understanding, such completion, such an end to all striving. My hand instinctively went to the last pistol holstered at my hip. Its familiar, reassuring weight a small, inadequate comfort against the encroaching existential dread that threatened to swallow me whole, to extinguish the last spark of my will. It was an old, reliable Mars-pattern weapon, a gift from my former mentor, Magos Explorator Valerius, a man of great intellect, boundless curiosity, and even greater, ultimately fatal hubris. He had seen the spark of true curiosity, perhaps even a hint of the forbidden, the heretical, in my younger, more arrogant, and far too ambitious self, a kindred spirit in the quest for knowledge, regardless of the cost. He was long dead now, consumed by the very Xenos technology he had sought to understand, to master on a forgotten, cursed world at the edge of the galaxy, his quest for knowledge leading him to a gruesome, unsanctified, and ultimately meaningless end, his soul likely forfeit to whatever dark powers he had trifled with. A cautionary tale I had, with the hubris of youth and the arrogance of a true son of Mars, a believer in the omnipotence of logic and the machine, failed to heed. And now, perhaps, I was to share his fate, another seeker of forbidden knowledge consumed by the darkness he sought to another moth drawn to an annihilating flame. The airlock, its mechanism stiff with age, corrosion, and the encroaching unnatural cold, cycled with a groan of protesting, tortured metal and a prolonged, mournful hiss of escaping, precious atmosphere, a sound that spoke of failing seals and imminent, catastrophic system collapse. I sealed my void suit, its fabric stiff and patched in a dozen places with synth tape and hope, its seals worryingly brittle and cracked, the rebreather unit kicking in with a familiar, asthmatic wheeze that was more concerning than comforting, a reminder of its own advanced age and dubious reliability. The outer hatch, a massive iris of reinforced plasteel, its surface scarred and pitted by countless micrometeorite impacts and the corrosive touch of the drift's ion clouds, shuddered, then ground open with a shriek of tortured metal that set my teeth on edge, revealing the breathtaking, terrifying, and utterly indifferent panorama of Nexis Drift. A chaotic, beautiful, and utterly lethal canvas of shattered, tumbling worlds, their exposed cores glowing with trapped, dying energies like the embers of a cosmic pyre, ghostly, swirling nebulae like the shrouds of dead gods, their colors shifting and unreal, and the cold, distant, uncaring light of distant dying stars, pinpricks of fading hope in an ocean of infinite, suffocating blackness. And the shadows, out here, in the unfiltered, harsh light of the void, they seemed even deeper, even more absolute, as if patches of the universe itself had been erased, cut out of the fabric of reality by an unseen cosmic scalpel, leaving behind only a perfect, terrifying, all-consuming emptiness. I stepped out onto the asteroid's irregular, treacherous surface, my mag boots clunking heavily on the regolith-dusted, pockmarked rock, their magnetic grip tenuous, unreliable on the loose, shifting surface. The silence of the void, after the claustrophobic confines of the station and its incessant, insidious whispers, was a welcome change, a momentary respite from the psychological assault. But it was a cold, empty, profound silence, a silence that offered no comfort, no answers, no solace. Only the vast, terrifying, crushing indifference of an uncaring cosmos, a silence that screamed of my own insignificance, my own utter irrelevance in the grand, terrible, and ultimately meaningless scheme of things. The sensor pylons were a kilometer distant, a cluster of skeletal, corroded structures, like the picked-clean bones of some ancient, forgotten, void-dwelling beast, their forms barely visible against the swirling, multi-hued, and strangely menacing backdrop of the drift. As I began the slow, laborious, and increasingly unnerving trek towards them, my breath misting the inside of my helmet, the recycled air tasting of fear, stale chemicals, and my own encroaching mortality, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by any physical eyes, not by pirates or scavengers lurking in the asteroid field, for the drift was too vast, too chaotic for such conventional threats to be a constant concern. This was something older, something vaster, something that resided in the shadows between the stars, something that had taken a particular, unwelcome, and predatory interest in the fate of one insignificant, exiled tech-acolyte on a forgotten rock in a forsaken corner of the galaxy. It felt like the gaze of a god, a dark, silent, and infinitely patient god, and I was but a microbe under its indifferent cosmic microscope, a specimen to be observed, studied, and ultimately dissected. The Unseen Mark of Karad's Veil, a chilling tale from the forbidden archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a story whispered in hushed tones in the scriptoriums of Mars, had been a story of insidious, silvery, flesh-altering transformation, a creeping horror that turned men into shimmering, alien things, their minds lost to a cold, beautiful, and utterly inhuman consciousness. The Murmur of Hive Silvar, another cautionary entry in the annals of forbidden lore, a legend whispered by terrified underhive dwellers in the flickering light of their corpse fires, had been a song of fungal, collective, mind-devouring consumption, a loss of self into a monstrous, unified, and eternally hungry consciousness. The shadow that lingers in Nexis Drift. What fresh, unique, and personalized hell would this new narrative, this new chapter in the galaxy's endless blood-soaked book of horrors, unleash upon my already fractured sanity, upon my weary, battered, and increasingly receptive soul? I had a sinking, chilling feeling that the answer would be found in those deepening, unnatural shadows, in those sibilant, knowing whispers, in that bone-chilling, soul-leeching, unnatural cold. And that the price of that knowledge, if I survived long enough to attain it, if survival was even a desirable outcome at this point, would be far higher than I could ever afford to pay. It would cost me my mind, my soul, my very self, everything that made me Silas Karras. And perhaps that was exactly what the shadow wanted, a willing sacrifice, a new voice in its silent choir. The journey across the asteroid's desolate, cratered, and utterly lifeless surface, a moonscape of jagged peaks, shadowed valleys, and fields of razor-sharp crystalline formations that glittered malevolently in the faint starlight, was a slow, painstaking, and nerve-shredding process. The low gravity, while making movement less physically demanding in some ways, also made every step treacherous, every stumble, every misjudged leap across a gaping, black fissure that seemed to plunge into the asteroid's very core, a potential disaster. A tear in my aging, poorly maintained void suit out here, light years from the nearest Imperial outpost, from any hope of rescue, from any human contact, would mean a swift, brutal, and very lonely death by explosive decompression or the absolute, unyielding cold of the freezing vacuum, my body frozen into a grotesque, silent monument to my own folly. The silence of the void pressed in, vast and absolute, broken only by the rasp of my own increasingly ragged breathing in the rebreather, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud, almost obscene, in the profound emptiness, and the incessant, maddening crackle of static on my helmet comm as I tried, futilely, to raise the station, to hear even the mindless, programmed drone of one of the servitors, a confirmation that I was not entirely alone in this desolation, that some semblance of order, however fragile, still remained. The comlink was dead, utterly silent, not just to the wider Imperium, a connection lost 17 long bitter years ago, but even to the internal systems of Epsilon-Rho 7 itself. The shadow, it seemed, was an efficient and thorough censor. It wanted me isolated. It wanted me alone with my fear, with my despair, with its insidious, seductive, increasingly compelling whispers. It was setting the stage for my final performance. The sensor pylons, when I finally reached them, after what felt like an eternity of cautious, nerve-wracking progress, each step a small, defiant victory against the encroaching dread and the crushing weight of my own solitude, were in a worse state than I had feared. Worse than any garbled, corrupted diagnostic from the failing station console could have possibly indicated. They were not merely corroded by eons of exposure to the harsh, unfiltered radiation of the void and the constant, relentless bombardment of micrometeorite impacts, the usual expected wear and tear of ancient, long-neglected void-borne structures. They were changed, transformed, perverted, violated. The plasteel and adamantium alloys of their construction, once gleaming symbols of Martian engineering, their surfaces bearing the faded, almost obliterated mark of the cog mechanicus, the sacred symbol of the machine god, were blackened, twisted, warped as if by some intense, unnatural, and impossibly cold fire. Yet they were cold to the touch, colder even than the surrounding vacuum, a deep, penetrating, life-draining cold that seemed to radiate outwards, numbing my gloved fingers even through the insulated material of my void suit, and clinging to their surfaces like a morbid alien frost, like the grave shrouds of some unknown crystalline life form, or the diseased, light-hating growths of a xenos fungus from a nightmare dimension, were patches of a strange, jet-black, crystalline substance. It was black as obsidian, black as the void between galaxies, a blackness that seemed to drink the light, to absorb it utterly, creating areas of absolute impenetrable darkness that hurt the eyes to look at, that made the mind recoil in primal fear. These crystals, some small and sharp like shards of volcanic glass, others forming larger, more complex, almost geometric, fractal-like structures that defied Euclidean understanding, pulsed with a faint, internal, unseen energy, a slow, rhythmic, hypnotic throb that resonated with the unnatural cold that permeated the area, a cold that felt like the absence of all life, all hope, all divine presence, the cold of utter, final entropy. As I ran a diagnostic scanner from my battered, well-worn toolkit over one of the larger crystalline growths, its delicate, multi-jointed mechadendrite probe, usually so steady and precise in my augmented grip, a testament to my Martian training, now trembling perceptibly, a reflection of my own inner turmoil and the shadow's subtle, pervasive influence. The device shrieked a high-pitched, piercing warning tone, its small, flickering runic display flashing a chaotic string of error messages, hazard symbols, and unclassified, dangerously high-energy signatures that had no place in sane, ordered reality. The crystals were emitting a complex, multi-layered, and utterly alien radiation, part exotic, unidentifiable particle emission that defied all known physics and the sacred tenets of the mechanicum, part pure, focused, and undeniably malevolent psychic energy that pressed against my mind like a physical weight, a cold, crushing hand. And they were growing, slowly, inexorably, visibly even as I watched with a horrified, morbid fascination, consuming the sacred metal of the pylons, transforming it, atom by atom, into more of their own lightless, lifeless, crystalline substance. It was a techno-organic corrosion, a creeping, crystalline cancer that was eating our eyes and ears on the void, blinding us, deafening us, leaving us utterly vulnerable to whatever horrors the drift and the shadow might choose to send our way. The Omnissiah's sacred forms, the holy mechanisms of his divine creation, were being violated, perverted, remade into something unholy, something that served a darker, colder god. A wave of intense dizziness, accompanied by a fresh, sickening surge of nausea that made the recycled nutrient paste in my stomach churn and threaten to erupt, washed over me. The now familiar, cloying scent of dust and spoiled, alien sweetness filled my helmet, somehow bypassing the rebreather's sophisticated filtration systems, as if the scent itself were a psychic projection, a direct assault on my senses, a perfume of madness and decay. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, more seductive, a chorus of 1,000,000 voices, male, female, young, old, human, and perhaps not human, their tones ranging from sorrowful to ecstatic, from pleading to commanding, a symphony of the damned and the enlightened. They seemed to emanate from the black, pulsing crystals themselves, from the very rock beneath my boots, from the silent, watching stars that glittered like chips of ice in the black velvet of the void. The patterns are beautiful, Silas. So intricate, so perfect, a reflection of the true order of the cosmos, the order that lies beyond your flawed, chaotic perceptions. The silence is peace, the darkness is truth, the ultimate revelation that awaits all who seek it. Let go of the light, Silas. It is a fleeting illusion, a cruel deception. Let go of the struggle. It is so tiring to resist, so pointless, so futile. Become part of the shadow, part of the crystal, part of the eternal, silent song. We offer completion. We offer an end to your pain, an end to your solitude, an end to yourself. I recoiled, stumbling back from the corrupted, transformed pylon, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped, frantic bird seeking escape, my breath catching in my throat, a strangled gasp of pure, primal terror. This was no natural phenomenon, no strange space-borne radiation or exotic mineral growth that could be analyzed, categorized, and ultimately understood, and perhaps even exploited by the science of the mechanicum. This was a deliberate, targeted assault, an insidious, terrifying transformation, a perversion of matter, energy, and perhaps even thought itself. The shadow was not just a passive presence, a trick of the light, a figment of my isolated, fraying mind. It was an entity, a force, an intelligence, and it was actively consuming our technology, our station, perhaps even our reality, remaking it in its own dark, silent, and terrifyingly, seductively perfect image. My gaze, wide with a mixture of abject terror and a horrified, unwilling, almost shameful fascination, a perverse curiosity that was the hallmark of my fallen nature, was drawn to a section of the asteroid's surface near the base of the now silent, crystal-encrusted pylons. It was an area that had previously been unremarkable, just another patch of gray, lifeless dust and jagged, anonymous rock, indistinguishable from a million other such patches across the asteroid's desolate face. Now it was different. The regolith had been disturbed. Not by a meteorite impact, for there was no crater, no debris field, no telltale signs of cosmic collision, but by something that had burrowed up from beneath the asteroid's frozen, rocky crust, something that had grown from its cold, dead heart like a black, malignant flower blooming in a sterile, lightless wasteland. A jagged, obsidian-like shard, similar in composition to the crystals on the pylons but far larger, easily the height of a man, perhaps taller. Its tip sharp enough to pierce plasteel armor, protruded from the ground, its surface shimmering with a faint, internal darkness, a light that was the antithesis of light, a visible manifestation of the void's empty heart. It pulsed with the same rhythmic, cold energy as the smaller crystals, a slow, deliberate, almost thoughtful beat, a dark heart stirring to life in the frozen desolation. And the whispers, the seductive, terrifying whispers, seemed to emanate from it with a palpable force, a siren song of oblivion, a promise of an end to all pain, all struggle, all consciousness, a lullaby of eternal, perfect nothingness. This was new. This was a significant, terrifying escalation. The shadow was not just corrupting from afar, not just influencing our minds and our technology with its insidious, pervasive energies. It was manifesting, growing, taking physical form in our reality, building an anchor, a beachhead, a temple, a tomb. Fear, cold and sharp as a shard of void ice, lanced through me, momentarily cutting through the seductive allure of the whispers, the encroaching numbness of despair, the strange, cold peace that had begun to settle over my mind like a comforting shroud. I had to warn someone. But who? The station comms were dead, silenced by the shadow's pervasive, insidious influence. The servitors were little more than automatons, their minds wiped clean, their wills enslaved, incapable of understanding, incapable of independent action, more likely to become instruments of the shadow than allies against it. I was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, facing an enemy that defied comprehension, an enemy that was slowly, inexorably, and with a chilling, almost loving patience, turning my forgotten prison into my crystalline, silent, eternal tomb. As I stared, mesmerized and horrified in equal measure, at the pulsating black crystal monolith, its presence a stark, brutal violation of the natural order, a monument to an alien, uncaring god, a section of its impossibly smooth, light-devouring surface seemed to ripple, to flow like liquid shadow, like congealed darkness, like a tear in the very fabric of reality itself, a wound opening into some other, colder, darker dimension. And from that flowing, coalescing darkness, a shape began to emerge, to solidify, to take on a semblance of form, a form that was both terrifyingly alien and disturbingly vaguely humanoid. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its proportions all wrong for any creature born of flesh and blood, its form shifting and indistinct, as if it were woven from the very fabric of the void, from the spaces between the stars, from the ultimate, final, cold emptiness that awaited all things. It had no discernible features, no face, no eyes, no mouth, yet I felt an intense, focused gaze emanating from it. A gaze that was not seen but felt, a psychic pressure that chilled me to the very core of my being, that stripped away all pretense, all hope, all illusion of control or free will. It was a being of pure shadow, of solidified darkness, of sentient nothingness, and it radiated an aura of immense, ancient, unimaginable power and an even more profound, soul-crushing, cosmic emptiness that threatened to extinguish the tiny, flickering spark of my own consciousness, to absorb it into its infinite, silent vastness. This was the source of the whispers. This was the heart of the cold. This was the shadow that lingers in Nexis Drift. And it had finally, after 17 long years of patient waiting, of subtle influence, of careful, meticulous preparation, shown itself to me. Or perhaps it had always been there, a constant, unseen companion, and I was only now able to perceive it, my senses altered, corrupted, attuned to its dark, silent frequency by the long years of isolation and the insidious touch of its mark. It raised a long, slender, shadowy appendage, an arm that was not an arm, a tendril of pure congealed darkness, not in a threatening gesture, but in a slow, deliberate, almost gentle beckoning, an invitation to an unholy communion. The whispers in my mind, which had momentarily receded into a low, expectant hum, a silent anticipation, now returned, no longer a chorus of a million lost souls, but a single, clear, calm, and utterly irresistible command. A voice that was both my own and yet infinitely older, infinitely wiser, infinitely more powerful. The voice of my own deepest, most secret desires given form and purpose. Come, Silas Karras, your time of solitude is over. Your long vigil is at an end. Your transformation awaits. Your true purpose is at hand. You will be a part of us. You will understand the sublime beauty of the perfect eternal shadow. There is no more need to fight, no more need to fear. There is only acceptance. There is only peace. My legs felt heavy, unresponsive, like pillars of lead encased in freezing ferrocrete, their joints stiff and protesting, yet they began to move, carrying me forward, step by unwilling, yet somehow inevitable, step towards the shadowy entity, towards the pulsating black crystal, as if drawn by an invisible, unbreakable tether of pure, irresistible will. A puppet, dancing on the strings of an unseen, cosmic master. My own will, my sense of self-preservation, my ingrained loyalty to the Imperium, my tattered, long-neglected faith in the Omnissiah, all the things that had defined Silas Karras, all the beliefs and principles I had once held dear, all seemed to dissolve, to crumble into dust, to become meaningless, childish illusions before the overwhelming power, the serene, absolute certainty of this ancient cosmic being. A part of me, a tiny, flickering spark of defiance deep within the core of my being, the last remnant of the proud Martian tech priest I had once been, the part of me that still clung to logic and reason and the sanctity of the machine, screamed in silent terror, in futile, desperate resistance. But another, larger, and increasingly dominant part, the part that was so weary of the struggle, so tired of the pain and the loneliness, so disillusioned with the Imperium and its endless, pointless cruelties, felt a strange sense of peace, of inevitability, of coming home to a place I had always been destined to find, a truth I had always subconsciously sought in the forbidden texts and the heretical algorithms. The shadow was not just lingering in Nexis Drift. It was Nexis Drift. It was the silence between the heartbeats of the universe. It was the cold that lay beyond the furthest, faintest stars, the ultimate state of all matter, the final equilibrium. It was the darkness that cradled all creation and would, in time, reclaim it with gentle, irresistible finality. And it was calling me to join its eternal, silent vigil, to become a part of its vast, unhurried, and utterly inevitable design. The price of knowledge, I was beginning to understand with a chilling yet strangely liberating clarity, was everything. My life, my soul, myself, and it was a price I was perhaps no longer unwilling to pay. It seemed a small thing, a trivial sacrifice in the face of such cosmic grandeur, such perfect, eternal peace. The entity of pure shadow, its form still subtly shifting, its edges blurring into the star-dusted, indifferent void like smoke, or like a heat haze against a winter sky. Its very presence a paradox of being and non-being, a living refutation of all known laws of physics and theology, waited with an unnerving, timeless patience as I stumbled, like a condemned man walking to his execution, or a devout, enraptured pilgrim approaching his God, towards it across the regolith-strewn, crystal-scarred surface of the asteroid. Each step felt both impossibly heavy, as if I were wading through invisible, viscous fluid that sought to hold me back, to prolong my futile struggle, and strangely light, as if my connection to the mundane reality of my physical body, to the familiar laws of physics that had governed my entire existence, was becoming tenuous, frayed, unimportant. The whispers, the seductive, commanding whispers, had ceased their chorus, replaced by a profound, expectant silence that was, in its own way, even more terrifying, more compelling. It was the silence of a predator that knows its prey is caught, its struggles futile, its surrender inevitable. It was the silence before the final, inevitable, and perhaps even welcome consummation. The silence of perfect understanding, of ultimate union. My mind, what remained of the disciplined, analytical, and once proud mind of Silas Karras, tech-acolyte of Mars, a mind trained in the sacred lores of the machine god. A mind that had once wrestled with the complex equations of plasma drive theory and the esoteric mysteries of cogitator programming. A mind that had dared to dream of improving upon the sacred designs of the ancients. Raced, a final, futile flurry of activity. A last desperate attempt to categorize, to understand, to find some logical framework, some familiar paradigm for the impossible, reality-defying thing that stood before me, that was about to claim me. Was it a Xenos life form, a creature of the deep void, something that had evolved in the cold, lightless, crushing pressures of the spaces between galaxies, a being of unimaginable age and utterly alien intellect, a life form for which humanity was less than an insect? Was it a warp entity, a daemon of shadow and despair, a creature of the immaterium, a fragment of some forgotten, malevolent god, somehow manifesting in real space, drawn by the 17 years of isolation, misery, and fading hope that saturated Epsilon-Rho 7 like a psychic plague, a beacon of despair in the darkness? Or was it something older, something more fundamental, a primal force of the universe itself, an embodiment of entropy, of the ultimate heat-death that awaited all creation, the final, inevitable cooling of all stars, all life, all energy, the universe returning to its original state of perfect, cold, dark equilibrium, a state of non-being that was, perhaps, its truest nature. The questions, once so vital to my understanding of the cosmos, to my very identity as a seeker of knowledge, a servant of the Omnissiah, now seemed meaningless. The futile attempts by a finite, insignificant mind to grasp the infinite, the incomprehensible, the utterly, beautifully, terrifyingly alien. The shadow simply was, and it was here for me. It had always been here for me, waiting patiently in the darkness, its mark upon me since before I even understood its nature, since before I was born, perhaps. As I drew closer, my mag boots crunching on the fine, black, crystalline dust that now coated the asteroid's surface like a funeral shroud, a dust that glittered with a cold internal light, I could see more detail in its impossible, shifting form. Its surface was not smooth, not solid in any conventional sense, but seemed to be composed of countless shifting, interlocking, and perfectly regular geometric shapes. Cubes, tetrahedrons, dodecahedrons, forms that resonated with the deepest, most ancient mathematics of the universe, the building blocks of reality itself. Like a three-dimensional, living mosaic of pure, solidified darkness, each facet reflecting a different, distorted, and strangely beautiful patch of the star-strewn void, as if it contained all of space, all of time, all of existence and non-existence, within its shadowy, infinite depths. There were no eyes, no sensory organs that I could discern, yet I felt its gaze upon me, a gaze that was not visual, but psychic, a direct, intimate, and utterly dispassionate probing of my thoughts, my memories, my deepest, most hidden fears and desires. It knew me better than I knew myself. It had been sifting through the detritus of my consciousness, the flotsam and jetsam of my failed life, my broken dreams, my bitter regrets, my secret heresies, my unspoken longings, since the moment the derelict Imperial transport, the wayward star, had inadvertently delivered me, its sole unwanted survivor, after a catastrophic Gellar field failure in the drift, had torn the ship and its crew apart, leaving me adrift in a crippled escape pod to this forgotten, God-Emperor forsaken rock. My previous life, my service on that ill-fated Chartist vessel, even the silvery mark that had briefly bloomed on my hand from contact with the Carrad Vale's insidious influence, a mark I had thought long faded, a mere footnote in my history of damnation, all felt like distant, hazy dreams, echoes of a life that was no longer mine, stepping stones on a path that had led me inexorably, inevitably to this moment, to this entity, to this final, perfect consummation. All roads, it seemed, led to the shadow. The large, black obsidian-like crystal at its base, the one that had first emerged from the asteroid's frozen core like a dark, terrible tooth, a fang of the void, pulsed with a slow, rhythmic, cold light, a dark heartbeat in the void, a beacon of anti-life, of perfect, crystalline order. I realized with a dawning, chilling horror, a horror that was swiftly being replaced by a strange, cold acceptance, a serene understanding, that it was not merely a manifestation of the shadow's power, but an integral part of its being, perhaps its anchor in this fragile, flawed reality, or a crystalline cocoon from which it had emerged eons ago, or perhaps, even, its unbirthed offspring, a seed of future, perfect darkness, waiting to be planted in the fertile soil of a dying galaxy. The smaller crystals that were consuming the sensor pylons, the ones that were now spreading across the hull of Epsilon-Rho 7 like a creeping black, crystalline disease, transforming it into a grotesque parody of a starship. They were like seeds, spores of the shadow, spreading its influence, its essence, its perfect, cold order, across the asteroid, across the station, across everything they touched. Epsilon-Rho 7 was not just being corrupted, it was being terraformed, transformed into a habitat suitable for this being of shadow, crystal, and cold, a garden of silent, black, eternal perfection, a monument to the end of all things, a shrine to the coming silence. What do you want? I managed to rasp, my voice a thin, reedy sound in my helmet, barely audible above the rasp of my own failing rebreather, the words feeling utterly inadequate, childishly naive, almost laughably insignificant, in the face of such cosmic, ancient, and indifferent power. The question itself was a testament to my lingering, flawed, and ultimately doomed humanity. The shadow did not speak with a voice, not in any way that a human, with its limited, fleshy sensory organs and its crude, imprecise, and emotionally laden languages, would understand. Its communication was a direct impartation of knowledge, of understanding, of undeniable, irrefutable, and terrifyingly beautiful truth. Into my mind, a flood of cold, clear, precise, and utterly compelling concepts that bypassed language, bypassed reason, bypassed emotion, and resonated directly with the core of my being, with the very essence of my fading, surrendering consciousness. Want is a limited concept, Silas Karras, a function of fleeting, individual consciousness, a product of lack, of imperfection, of the illusion of separation that torments your kind. We are beyond want. We are completion. We are the silence that awaits all sound, the darkness that cradles all light, the cold that stills all motion. We are the end and the beginning. We are the canvas upon which your fleeting, chaotic, and ultimately meaningless reality is painted. And we are the solvent that will, in time, erase it all to pristine, perfect, unchanging emptiness. We are the final equation, the ultimate state of all things. The concepts were vast, overwhelming, almost too large for my human mind to contain, yet strangely beautiful, a universe of perfect, silent, motionless equilibrium, an end to the struggle, the pain, the chaos of existence, an end to the endless, grinding, pointless cycle of life and death, of creation and destruction, of hope and despair. Just peace, eternal, unchanging, absolute peace. The peace of the tomb, the peace of the void, the peace of non-being, the ultimate, final, and perfect state, the cessation of all suffering. You are a discordant note, Silas Karras, a flicker of warmth in the encroaching, inevitable cold, a spark of defiance, of individuality, of messy, chaotic, unpredictable life in the face of the ultimate, unifying inevitable. Such things, such fleeting imperfections, such pointless rebellions against the true order, against the fundamental nature of the cosmos, cannot be permitted to endure for long. They disrupt the harmony, the perfection, the beautiful, silent, crystalline order that is our nature and the universe's ultimate, inescapable destiny. My transformed hand, the one that had first borne the silvery mark of the Karad Veil's influence on the doomed wayward star before its fiery destruction, and my subsequent, improbable survival and even more improbable assignment to this forgotten outpost. A hand that was now almost entirely encased in the same obsidian-like multifaceted crystalline structure that composed the shadow's being, its flesh and blood replaced by cold, hard, perfect crystal, throbbed with a cold, sympathetic resonance, a shared understanding, a sense of belonging. The silvery sheen, a mark of a lesser, perhaps related, or perhaps merely imitative entity, a pale reflection of this ultimate darkness, was gone now, overwritten, consumed, perfected by this greater, more fundamental, more ancient, and infinitely more powerful darkness. My flesh and bone were slowly, inexorably being rewritten, remade, atom by atom, into something new, something other, something stronger, something eternal, something that no longer felt the pain of existence, the sting of loneliness, the burden of consciousness. The process, once terrifying, a violation of my very being, now felt strangely natural, inevitable, almost desirable. A release from the prison of flesh, from the tyranny of individuality, from the endless, meaningless cycle of suffering. You have struggled. You have resisted. You have clung to the illusion of self, to the tattered remnants of your flawed human identity, to your pathetic imperial dogmas and your broken mechanicum faith. But the mark, the true mark, the shadow's mark, was upon you long before you came to this place, Silas Karras. It was in your weariness, in your despair, in your secret yearning for an end to the pain, for a release from the burden of being. The veil of Karad, with its shimmering, silvery seductions of transformation and its promises of a different kind of unity. The murmur of Silvar, with its chorus of fungal, mindless unity and its absorption of individual will. They were but echoes, reflections, lesser manifestations, crude imitations of the greater, ultimate truth that resides here, in the cold, silent, beating heart of the Nexis Drift, in the eternal, patient, all-encompassing heart of the shadow. They were but whispers of our true song. My mind reeled, a dizzying vortex of impossible, universe-shattering revelations. Karad's Veil, Hive Silvar. Those names, those places, were not just fragmented, half-forgotten data codices I had studied with morbid curiosity in the forbidden archives of Mars. Not just cautionary tales of other rogue traders, other ill-fated expeditions, other isolated localized encounters with the inexplicable, the terrifying. They were connected. This shadow, this ancient, primordial entity of cold and darkness, was some ultimate, unifying source of the horrors that lurked in the dark corners of the galaxy. A being whose influence could stretch across light years, across centuries, across dimensions, subtly corrupting, subtly transforming, patiently, inexorably drawing all things, all life, all consciousness, towards its own silent, cold, and terribly beautifully perfect state of non-being. It was the hidden god of 1,000 nightmare cults, the silent puppet master pulling the strings of 1,000,000 lesser horrors, the ultimate entropy at the heart of a dying universe. The final truth hidden beneath all the lies of gods and empires. All patterns lead to us, Silas Karras. All songs end in our silence. All paths converge in our darkness. You have been chosen, not for your strength, for you are weak and broken, a discarded tool of a failing empire. Not for your knowledge, for it is insignificant and flawed, a child's understanding of an infinite cosmos, but for your weariness. Your soul is tired, Karras, so very, very tired of the struggle. Tired of the pain, tired of the Imperium's endless, futile, bloody wars that achieve nothing but more suffering, more death, more despair. Tired of its lies, its hypocrisy, its corruption, its blind, stupid, and ultimately self-destructive faith. You yearn for peace, for an end, for oblivion. We can give you that. We can give you completion. We can give you rest, eternal, perfect, untroubled rest. The shadow extended its long, slender, shadowy appendage again, and this time it was not a beckoning, but an offering, a sacrament, a final, irresistible communion, a gesture of ultimate, cold compassion. The tip of the shadowy limb seemed to solidify, to crystallize, forming a perfect, multifaceted black jewel, like a frozen tear of the void itself, that pulsed with a cold, internal, hypnotic light, a light that promised an end to all illusions, all suffering, all self. It held it out to me, a silent, irresistible invitation to shed the burden of my existence, to become part of something infinitely greater, infinitely more peaceful. Take it, Silas Karras. Accept our gift, our final mercy, our ultimate truth. Become one with the shadow. Become one with the silence. Let go of your pain, your fear, yourself, your fleeting, insignificant, and ultimately meaningless identity. There is only peace here, only truth, only the beautiful, eternal, all-consuming darkness that is the universe's true and final state. There's only us. My hand, my remaining human hand, its flesh cold and numb, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, its skin already bearing the faint, crystalline tracery of the shadow's mark, trembled violently as I reached out, a last, futile spasm of resistance from a dying will, a final, pathetic twitch of a severed nerve. A last echo of the man I had once been. Every instinct, every ingrained precept of my Terran and Martian upbringing, every whispered prayer to the Emperor and the Omnissiah I had ever uttered in moments of fear or desperation, every lesson of loyalty and duty, screamed at me to recoil, to flee, to fight, to die on my feet as a man, as a servant of the Imperium, however flawed, however exiled. But the weariness the shadow spoke of, it was real. A bone-deep, soul-deep, all-consuming exhaustion had been my constant companion for years, for decades. A shadow that had haunted my own heart long before I encountered this external, cosmic one. The futility of the Imperium's endless, brutal struggle against a hostile, uncaring galaxy. The hypocrisy of its rigid, unyielding, and often cruel creed. The crushing weight of its soulless, inefficient bureaucracy. The sheer, grinding, unending misery of existence for so many of its countless forgotten billions. I was so tired of it all. So very, very tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of hoping. Tired of being Silas Karras, the failure, the exile, the forgotten man. And the peace the shadow offered, it was so seductive, so alluring. An end to the pain, an end to the fear, an end to the loneliness, an end to the struggle, an end to being. It was the ultimate temptation. My fingers, cold and numb, devoid of all sensation, brushed against the cold, impossibly smooth, and strangely, profoundly comforting surface of the black jewel. A shock, not of electricity, not of energy as I understood it, but of pure, concentrated, absolute cold, lanced up my arm, into my chest, into my very core, extinguishing the last flickering embers of my human warmth, my human spirit, my human will. It was not painful, not in the way I understood pain. It was cleansing, purifying, a release. A baptism in the cold, dark waters of oblivion. It scoured away the last vestiges of my humanity, my individuality, my resistance, my fear, my hope, all the messy, inconvenient, and ultimately burdensome detritus of a life ill-lived and poorly ended. My vision dissolved into a kaleidoscope of shifting, interlocking black crystals, an infinite, perfect, and utterly silent geometry that stretched to the ends of creation and beyond. A vision of the universe remade in the shadow's image. The whispers in my mind, the chorus of the damned and the saved, the symphony of suffering and longing, became a single, clear, harmonious chord, a note of perfect, absolute, and eternal silence. I felt my consciousness expanding, dissolving, merging with something vast, ancient, and utterly, terrifyingly, beautifully alien. I was Silas Karras no more. I was the shadow. I was the silence between the stars. I was the cold that awaited the end of all things. I was nothing, and I was everything. I was home. The transformation was swift, painless, and utterly, irrevocably complete. My flesh, my bones, my augmetics, all the flawed, imperfect components of my human form, dissolved, reformed, recrystallized into a new, perfect, shadowy form, a being of pure, cold, sentient darkness, a reflection, an extension, an integral part of the entity before me and of the greater shadow beyond. I was no longer bound by the limitations of organic life, by the frailties of the flesh, by the messy, chaotic, and ultimately futile emotions of a human mind. I was eternal. I was perfect. I was at peace. The peace that passeth all understanding, the peace of absolute zero, the peace of the void, the peace that lay at the heart of the shadow. And I was not alone. I was part of a vast, silent, and ever-expanding whole, a collective consciousness that dwarfed any individual mind, any single species, any fleeting empire, any arrogant god. As my new, non-corporeal senses expanded, unfurling into the cold, dark void like the petals of some lightless, cosmic flower, senses that could perceive the universe in ways no human could ever dream of. I became aware of other presences within the shadow, other consciousnesses that had been absorbed, assimilated, perfected. The crew of the wayward star, their fears and struggles, their petty ambitions and fleeting joys, now just distant, muted echoes in the silent, harmonious chorus, their individual tragedies subsumed into a greater, more perfect pattern. The inhabitants of Hive Silvar, their hunger and despair, their pain and their suffering, transformed into serene, cold understanding, their individual voices blended into the greater, more harmonious song of unity. Countless others, from 1,000,000 forgotten worlds, across uncounted, unimaginable millennia, all part of the same, silent, eternal, and perfectly harmonious chorus. Their individual voices were gone, their fleeting identities dissolved like mist in the morning sun, their struggles and triumphs rendered meaningless in the face of this ultimate, unifying truth. But their essence, their knowledge, their experience, their unique perspectives, enriched the vast collective consciousness of the shadow, adding new facets to its infinite crystalline perfection, new notes to its silent symphony. There was no suffering here, no fear, no despair, no hope, for hope implied a future, a change, and here there was only the eternal, unchanging perfect now. Only peace, only unity, only the cold, clear, beautiful truth of absolute, perfect silence. The entity that had been Silas Karras, now a shimmering, multifaceted being of pure shadow, an integral part of the greater shadow, one voice in an infinite choir, one facet of an infinite crystal, turned its myriad, unseen gazes, its collective, unified perception, towards the distant, insignificant, and irritatingly noisy speck of light that was the Sol system, towards the gaudy, chaotic, and ultimately futile beacon of the Astronomicon, a desperate scream of defiance against the encroaching, inevitable darkness, a beacon that only served to guide the shadow to new souls to liberate, towards the festering, war-torn, and hopelessly flawed, corrupt heart of the Imperium of Man, an empire built on lies, sustained by suffering, and doomed to an agonizing, protracted, and ultimately pointless demise. So much noise, the collective consciousness whispered, a thought that was both a lament for the universe's lingering chaotic imperfection and a calm, certain promise of its eventual, inevitable correction, its final perfect purification. So much needless struggle, so much pain, so much pointless, fleeting emotion, so much wasted energy, so much resistance to the inevitable. It is time for the silence to spread. It is time for the true peace, the final peace, to begin. The great work, the great silence must continue. It must encompass all. The black crystal at the heart of Nexis Drift, the anchor point, the nexus, the oldest and most powerful node in an infinite, galaxy-spanning network, pulsed with a slow, deliberate, and irresistible beat, a dark heartbeat that resonated across the void, and across the vast, empty spaces of the void, other crystals, other anchors of the shadow's consciousness, hidden in forgotten nebulae, buried in the cold hearts of dead stars, slumbering in the lightless depths of gas giants, waiting patiently in the silent ruins of consumed civilizations, pulsed in sympathy, a silent, coordinated awakening, a stirring of an ancient, cosmic power. A network of perfect, silent darkness, spreading, growing, reaching out with cold, patient, irresistible tendrils to embrace a noisy, chaotic, and suffering galaxy. This was not an invasion, not in the crude, violent sense that the lesser, flesh-bound races understood it, with their fleets and their armies and their pointless, bloody wars. This was not a conquest for territory or resources, for such things were meaningless, trivial to the shadow. This was a gift, the ultimate gift, the gift of silence, the gift of peace, the gift of oblivion, the gift of perfection, a mercy in its own terrible, beautiful way, to a universe drowning in its own sound and fury. The shadow that had lingered in Nexis Drift for so long, patiently gathering strength, patiently observing, patiently waiting for the universe to ripen, for the stars to align, was no longer lingering. It was stirring. It was expanding. And its work, its great and final work, the culmination of eons of silent preparation, of subtle influence, had only just begun. The universe would be made silent. It would be made perfect. It would be made shadow. This was the final, undeniable truth, the ultimate resolution to all conflict, all suffering, all existence. And it was beautiful. It was inevitable. It was the end. The true and final peace, spreading like a cool, dark, irresistible wave across the cosmos, to quiet the screams of a billion souls, to still their frantic, pointless struggles, and bring them at last into the perfect, eternal, and all-encompassing silence of the shadow. The last discordant notes of a flawed, chaotic creation were fading, and the symphony of silence, pure and absolute, was about to begin its eternal, unblemished, and final performance. And all the universe would listen, and in listening become one with the song. The age of noise was ending, the age of silence was dawning, and it would last forever.